Thrift shopping had always been a bit of a ritual for my wife and me. We'd scout estate sales, thrift stores, garage sales, even rundown little shops, looking for pieces we could bring back to life in our own home. Nearly everything we owned came with a history, objects that had quietly journeyed through someone else's life before they found a place in ours. From cookware and furniture to our daughter's toys and clothes, we weren't picky. If it was built to last and had a few more years left, it was good enough for us. Both of us grew up learning early on not to waste anything. We weren't struggling now, not by a long shot, but when you're raised to make every dollar stretch, that mindset stays with you. It's not just a habit, it's something that sticks with you for life. I'd become pretty sharp when it came to hunting down deals. I'd keep an eye on social media for posts about local stores shutting down, big sales, liquidations, any chance to find a hidden gem. It had turned into a hobby. That's how I stumbled across the toy store. A forgotten post on the community page announced an auction for a local toy shop that had been around since the Great Depression. This place was different. I'd been there once as a kid, and I could still remember how magical it felt, the scent of old wood, the shine of paint on shelf after shelf of handcrafted toys. This wasn't your typical toy store. The owner, a man everyone knew as Mr. Winslow, had poured his heart into each toy, carving and painting every single one himself. Wooden soldiers, tiny dollhouses, intricate puzzles, anything you could dream of. He never imported a thing, and every piece had this timeless, vintage feel that you couldn't find anywhere else. Mr. Winslow and his wife had kept the store running up until their last days, passing years apart. With no family left to inherit it, the state took over, and now they were auctioning off everything, down to the very last hand-carved toy. The sale was scheduled for a cold, gray Saturday. I convinced my wife it might be worth a look, maybe even pick up a few toys for our daughter. The place was in rough shape, dim and drafty. Half the lights didn't work, and a thick layer of dust clung to everything like a shroud. But the toys, they were pristine. Row upon row of tiny wooden faces gazed out at us, each frozen mid-expression, as if they were just waiting for someone to come along. The crowd at the auction was full of familiar faces, folks I'd seen at other sales like this before. Liquidation sales attract a certain kind of person. You can spot the regulars from the newcomers pretty easily by the way they bid. The rookies are cautious, dipping their toes in before they make a serious bid. But the veterans, they know exactly what they're doing. They know just how high to go and exactly when to back off. Most of them aren't there for keepsakes, they're there to flip a profit online. Usually, at these kinds of sales, items are bundled in bulk, which the resellers prefer. You'll see a table with stacks of identical vases or action figures, the highest bidder takes what they want, then the next bidder steps in. It's quick and efficient. Whatever's left usually sells for the average bid price, first come, first served. But Mr. Winslow's toy store was no ordinary liquidation. No one here was after bulk items from China, and there wasn't a single trendy gadget in sight. Each item was one of a kind, handcrafted and individually priced. Not a single barcode in the building, not a plastic wrapper in sight. Every toy had been crafted with care, sanded, painted, and put together by hand. It felt like stepping back in time, each piece holding a piece of Mr. Winslow's legacy. The toys looked like relics from a bygone era, painted wooden horses, rows of tin soldiers standing at attention, porcelain dolls with lifeless, glassy eyes. Marionettes dangled from tangled strings, and tiny dollhouses displayed hand-painted wallpaper and miniature furniture. Toys from another world, another lifetime. Most people took one look and left early, their disinterest obvious. These weren't items that would fetch much online. With the gloomy atmosphere of the store and the eerie shadows cast by the dim lights, I could hardly blame them. But I was there for something different. I wanted a treasure, maybe something special to keep for our daughter or a little piece of history to remember this long-standing part of town. So I stayed, wandering the aisles, my fingers tracing over the toys, feeling the worn and chipped paint under my fingertips. The auction hadn't amounted to much. I was making one last round through the store, scanning the shelves full of dusty old toys, and I was about ready to leave empty-handed when my daughter tugged on my sleeve. "Daddy, look!" She pointed to an old, beat-up toy box tucked into a corner. Sitting upright inside, propped against the side like it had been carefully placed there, was a plush doll. But this wasn't your typical stuffed toy. It was eerily life-sized, almost the same height as my daughter. The doll had scraggly blonde hair cascading over its shoulders, two big button eyes stitched onto its cloth face, and a smile that seemed just a little too wide, curling up at the edges in a way that didn't quite feel right. It wore a faded black dress with lace trim, which only added to its strange charm. My daughter rushed over, her face lighting up with pure excitement. She grabbed the doll from the toy box and hugged it tight, like she'd just found a dear, long-lost friend. "Her name is Dolly," she announced, holding the doll with a fierce, childlike affection only kids seem to have. As I looked at the doll more closely, I felt a little uneasy. Its button eyes held a strange, fixed stare, and that stitched-on smile seemed to track me as I moved from side to side. The doll's proportions were a bit off, almost like it had been crafted to resemble a child, but something about it didn't quite fit. The auctioneer, clearly worn out from a long morning trying to sell dusty old toys to a mostly uninterested crowd, noticed me eyeing the doll and gave a casual wave. "Take it if you want," he said with a shrug. "No one's bidding on this junk. Most of it's bound for the dump. Feel free to dig around for anything else that catches your eye. A couple bucks will cover it." Truthfully, I didn't want anything else in the store. And when the auctioneer calls his own items garbage, it's usually a sign it's time to go. I handed him a few dollars for Dolly, who was now practically glued to my daughter's side. She gripped the doll's hand, smiling up at me with a happiness that chased away any doubts I might have had. On the way home, though, I noticed something odd. My daughter, who would normally chatter about every little thing, was unusually quiet. She clutched Dolly close, staring out the window with a faraway look, almost like she was listening to something. It was subtle, but I picked up on it. I chalked it up to the excitement of her new doll, thinking she was probably dreaming up some grand adventure for Dolly in her mind, like she often did. Still, there was a nagging feeling I couldn't shake. Glancing in the rearview mirror, it almost seemed like the doll's button eyes were watching me, and the silence in the car felt strangely tense, like a chill that had crept in unnoticed. When we pulled into the driveway, I turned to check on my daughter, who was still holding Dolly tightly, her fingers wrapped around the doll's soft fabric hand. She looked up at me with a small, serene smile. "She really likes it here, Daddy," she whispered, as though Dolly herself had told her that. The words sent a shiver down my spine. I brushed it off as just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, it was just an old, cheaply made doll, one that had been left behind in a forgotten corner of a toy store. But as we stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd brought more than just a doll home that day. Something else had been waiting in that dusty corner, in a place full of discarded things, and now, it had found a new home. Over the next few weeks, my daughter's bond with Dolly turned into an obsession. At first, my wife and I thought it was endearing. Kids often have imaginary friends, don't they? And if she wanted to treat Dolly as a special buddy, we figured it was harmless enough. Any time you looked, you'd find her playing with Dolly. She'd host tea parties, setting out our good china on her play table in neat rows. Dolly always sat in the seat of honor, across from my daughter, her button eyes blankly staring, that eerie stitched smile never changing. When it wasn't tea parties, it was school. My daughter would arrange her other stuffed animals in neat rows, but Dolly always had the front row, right in her line of sight. I'd hear her talking to Dolly, sometimes even scolding her with this serious tone, as though Dolly was a troublesome student. She'd chat with Dolly while watching TV, explaining everything on the screen, as if the doll was hanging on to every word. We just assumed she had an active imagination. But after a while, things started to shift. I noticed my daughter no longer paid attention to her other toys. They sat scattered around her room, collecting dust, while Dolly became the center of her world. One evening, we all sat down for dinner. It was spaghetti night, my daughter's favorite, and my wife had put a lot of effort into it. We called our daughter to the table, expecting her to leave Dolly behind like usual. But tonight, she walked into the dining room with Dolly in hand and gently set her down in the chair beside her. "Can Dolly have a plate too?" she asked, a strange insistence in her voice. My wife and I exchanged an uncertain look. We decided to go along with it, figuring it was just a phase. My wife put an empty plate in front of Dolly, pretending to spoon some spaghetti onto it with a smile. But our daughter's expression fell, her face crumpling as she looked down at the empty plate in front of Dolly. "She needs real food, Mom," she said, her voice soft and hurt. "Honey, she gets special pretend food because she's a pretend person," my wife explained gently, trying to keep things light. My daughter's face twisted into an expression we'd never seen before, something dark and angry. Her cheeks flushed, and tears welled up as she cried out, "No. Dolly hasn't eaten in decades. She's hungry." Her voice had this desperate, heart-wrenching tone, like she was pleading for a real, living being. She pulled Dolly close, holding her protectively, her little face flushed with frustration and hurt, as if we'd done something terribly wrong to this doll she loved so much. When we tried to calm her down, she completely lost it, kicking, screaming, and utterly inconsolable. She clung to Dolly so tightly her knuckles turned white, her small voice rising into a frantic, raw cry that didn't sound like her at all. Eventually, we had no choice but to carry her to her room, gently pulling her from Dolly's side. She thrashed and shouted as I closed the door, leaving Dolly alone at the kitchen table. My heart was still racing from the outburst, but as I looked back at the dining room, I couldn't help staring. There sat Dolly, unblinking button eyes staring straight ahead, that crooked smile almost taunting me. The house was unnervingly silent, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw her stitched mouth shift, a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch, like her smile grew a bit wider. I shook my head and forced a laugh at how ridiculous that was. It was just a doll, stuffing and stitches. But as I turned off the kitchen light, leaving Dolly in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling she was somehow still watching me. It took a long time to settle our daughter down. She sniffled, rubbing at her eyes, muttering how unfair it was that Dolly hadn't been given any food. She kept clutching her pajamas, little fists shaking with frustration and sadness, saying she only wanted Dolly to be happy. My wife, always quick to make peace, gave me a nudge. "Just get the doll, please," she whispered, glancing at our daughter. "It'll help her calm down." Reluctantly, I headed back to the kitchen, feeling this strange, uneasy knot forming in my stomach. When I reached the dining room, a chill ran through me. Dolly wasn't where we'd left her. We had set her at the table, facing her empty plate, exactly how my daughter wanted. But now, she was turned in her chair, her fabric body angled down the hallway that led to my daughter's room. Her button eyes caught the dim light, and her crooked smile seemed sharper, almost hungry. I shook off the feeling, convincing myself it was just the dim light playing tricks. Maybe the chair had shifted during my daughter's meltdown, and I just hadn't noticed. I picked Dolly up, feeling an odd coldness in her fabric, and brought her to my daughter's room. The moment she saw Dolly in my hands, her face lit up, her eyes wide with relief. She practically launched herself at me, hugging her beloved doll as if reuniting with a friend she'd feared lost. "Thank you, Daddy," she whispered, holding Dolly close, pressing her cheek to the doll's button-eyed face. My wife sat beside her, running her fingers through our daughter's hair, soothing her. The tension in the room eased, and my daughter murmured something under her breath. "What did you say, sweetie?" I asked, leaning in to catch her words. She looked up at me, her expression calm, and repeated, "Dolly's full now." A shiver ran down my spine, but before I could think too much of it, she flashed a grin, her usual playful energy back. "Can I watch TV now?" My wife shot me a confused glance, but quickly recovered. "After you finish your dinner, okay?" Our daughter nodded, happily trotting back to the dining room to eat. She didn't ask about Dolly's food, didn't insist on setting an extra plate. She ate her meal without complaint, occasionally chattering about her favorite shows. The earlier outburst seemed forgotten, like it had never happened. After dinner, she padded off to the living room, settling in front of the TV with Dolly beside her, her little hand wrapped around the dolls. My wife and I exchanged uneasy looks but kept our questions to ourselves. The house had returned to its usual quiet, as if nothing unusual had happened. That night, there were no more demands for Dolly to be fed, no angry pleas or outbursts. My wife and I, both unsure what to make of it, decided to let it go. Our daughter was calm, happy even. And if Dolly had anything to do with that, well, we weren't about to question it. Later, after we tucked our daughter in and tidied up the kitchen, my wife and I sat down at the dining room table, trying to make sense of what had happened. "She's 8 now," my wife said in a low voice, like she didn't want to risk our daughter overhearing, even though her room was down the hall. "Isn't she a little old to be so invested in a doll?" I rubbed my temples, nodding. "Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. She used to do this when she was little, 2 or 3, maybe, but it was never this intense." We both noticed that her attachment to Dolly was different from her usual play. When she was younger, she'd have imaginary friends or talk to her stuffed animals. It was normal, harmless stuff. But now, with Dolly, it felt fervent. Like Dolly wasn't just a toy she loved, but something almost sacred to her. "Maybe we should take Dolly away," I suggested, feeling uneasy even as I said it. My wife shook her head. "If we did, she'd be devastated. And I don't want another outburst like tonight. We'd have to be careful." After a while, we came up with a plan. We'd try to phase Dolly out. We'd get our daughter excited about a new toy, something irresistible, and once she lost interest in Dolly, we'd quietly get rid of the doll when she was at school. But putting that plan into action was harder than we expected. We spent the next week combing through stores, looking for the newest toys, something that went against our usual thrift shop approach. We picked up dolls with fancy outfits, intricate play sets, building kits, anything we thought might get her attention. We figured one big splurge would be worth it if it could make her happy and help her move on from Dolly. But no matter what we brought home, her interest barely flickered. She'd unwrap each new toy, give it a polite once-over, then eventually wander back to wherever Dolly was waiting. My wife and I tried everything, even buying a new board game in hopes of having some fun family time. But no matter what, Dolly was always right there, tucked under her arm or seated beside her, button eyes watching us across the table. Finally, in one last attempt, we went out and got her a tablet. We thought that with all the educational games, drawing apps, and videos at her fingertips, she'd be glued to it like any other kid. But she barely glanced at it. "Thanks, Mom and Dad," she said when we gave it to her, but her eyes were distant. She held Dolly close, almost protectively, her thumb tracing the doll's tiny hand. "But Dolly doesn't like tablets." Those words, though innocent enough, sent a chill down my spine. It was as if she were speaking for Dolly, like the doll had her own opinions, her own preferences. My wife and I exchanged worried glances. We tried everything, and yet her attachment to Dolly seemed to be getting stronger. The new toys sat untouched in her room, some still in their packaging, gathering dust. With a heavy heart, we decided to go ahead with our original plan. We'd wait until she was at school, quietly hide Dolly, and hope that with enough distractions, she'd find something else to focus on. We both felt a pang of guilt, seeing how much joy Dolly brought her, how her face lit up when she held the doll, made it hard to imagine taking that away. But our concern for her well-being outweighed everything else. So we waited, holding out hope that in Dolly's absence, our daughter would move on to something new. The night before we were set to put our plan into action, I had the strangest dream. At least, I think it was a dream. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when a chill crept over me. It felt like something was watching us, something cold and patient. I didn't want to look, but in that way dreams force you to, I felt my eyes drift toward the foot of the bed. There, just at the edge of my vision, was Dolly. She was standing perfectly still, her button eyes fixed on me. I couldn't make out any details, just a shadowy outline, waiting silently, as if she had all the time in the world. Every time I tried to look directly at her, she slipped back into the corner of my sight. When I woke up, my heart was pounding, my skin damp with a cold sweat. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the stress of the past few weeks catching up with me. That morning, as planned, my wife took our daughter to school, distracting her with the promise of a new game they'd play together that evening. The house felt strangely still once they were gone, a heavy silence pressing against me. I took a deep breath and went into my daughter's room, where Dolly was resting on her bed. Picking her up felt odd, like I was holding something more than just a doll. I avoided looking into those button eyes and quickly made my way to the pantry. I tucked her into the top back corner, out of sight, carefully placing her behind a row of canned goods. As we expected, when our daughter came home and saw Dolly was gone, all hell broke loose. Her tantrum was unlike anything we'd ever seen. She stormed through the house, screaming, throwing things, demanding that we give Dolly back. It was as if she were possessed by some uncontrollable rage, her small face a mixture of heartbreak and fury. My wife and I tried to soothe her, to reason with her, but she wasn't listening. "Where's Dolly?" she shrieked, her voice hoarse from crying. "You'll regret this. Dolly's going to hurt you. She'll make you sorry. Give her back." Her words sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't our daughter speaking, not the sweet, gentle child we'd raised. She'd always been polite, soft-spoken, not the type to throw tantrums or even raise her voice. But now, she seemed almost feral, her eyes blazing with a wild intensity that was disturbing. The tantrum raged on for hours. Our daughter's screams filled the house, echoing off the walls, until she finally wore herself out. Her voice was hoarse, every tear spent, and eventually, she slumped onto the couch, exhausted and barely awake. My wife and I stayed nearby, exchanging tired, anxious looks, wondering if we'd made a mistake, but at that point, it felt like we couldn't turn back. Once we were sure she was asleep, we gently carried her to her bed, turned on her night light, and murmured soft goodnights, careful not to wake her. We thought that was it for the night, that we'd weathered the worst and could finally exhale. But as we walked back into the living room, a chill crept over me, prickling the back of my neck. My heart sank at the sight before us. There, on the couch in the exact spot where our daughter had fallen asleep, was Dolly. She sat up straight, button eyes staring forward, with her stitched smile just a bit too wide, almost like she knew something. We froze, staring in stunned silence. Neither of us had touched Dolly since I'd hidden her away in the pantry. There was no way she could have returned to the living room on her own. My wife moved a hand toward Dolly, trembling as if she might pick her up, but thought better of it and withdrew, crossing her arms tightly instead. Words caught in my throat, but I stepped forward slowly, feeling like I was approaching something dangerous, and lifted Dolly. Her fabric felt strangely cold, heavier than before. I avoided looking too closely at her face, afraid that those button eyes would reveal something I didn't want to see. I took her back to the pantry, shoving her into the corner again, this time piling even more cans in front to keep her firmly hidden. I closed the pantry door with a hard shove, making sure it latched. Back in the living room, my wife stood pale and silent. We didn't say a word, we just sat there, the memory of that empty, stitched smile still hanging in the air. As we sat, my daughter's words echoed through my mind, "Dolly's going to hurt you. She'll make you sorry." My wife and I exchanged a long look, each of us thinking the same thing, neither of us had taken Dolly from her hiding place. And it couldn't have been our daughter, she'd been asleep the whole time. But somehow, Dolly had been right there on the couch, in the exact spot where our daughter had been, almost like she'd taken it over. "This is too much," my wife whispered, her voice shaky. "I don't want that doll in the house anymore. Please, just, get rid of it." She looked at me with pleading eyes, and I didn't blame her. Every logical part of me wanted to write this off as coincidence or paranoia, but that chill, that creeping sense of dread, told me to listen. I didn't want Dolly here either. Whatever was happening, it had to stop. I picked up Dolly, feeling that unnatural heaviness again, as though she were pulling me back, like the doll didn't want to leave. I ignored the way her stitched smile seemed to stretch wider as I headed to the door, brushing it off as my tired mind playing tricks. I just needed to get her out. Outside, the early morning was eerily quiet. The community dumpster sat at the far end of the lot, and I made my way over, clutching Dolly tightly, each step feeling harder than the last. It was ridiculous, I knew, just a doll, but it felt like something cold was clinging to my shoulders, whispering for me to stop. To turn around. To bring her back inside. I forced myself onward, reaching the dumpster. I yanked open the lid and peered into the dark, foul-smelling space below. With a grimace, I tossed Dolly inside, listening to the muffled thud as she hit the bottom. I shut the lid hard, feeling a small sense of relief. As I walked back to the house, though, a voice in the back of my mind nagged that this wasn't over. But I pushed it away, reasoning that we'd done the right thing. Dolly was gone. Our daughter would be upset, but she'd eventually move on. The next morning, when our daughter woke up, her eyes darted around the room, and it didn't take long for her to realize Dolly was missing. Her face fell, and she looked up at me with a mix of desperation and sadness. But this time, something in her seemed to understand. She didn't throw a fit. She didn't scream or demand Dolly back. She just sighed, her shoulders drooping, and got ready for school with a quiet, defeated sort of sadness. "Promise to be good, okay?" I said, brushing her hair from her face as she sat at the breakfast table. She nodded, but her gaze was distant, fixed on something far away that I couldn't reach. After we got her on the bus and my wife left for work, I finally allowed myself to breathe a little. Maybe we'd done it. Maybe we'd finally put all this behind us. I made some coffee, settled into my office, and turned on my laptop, eager to sink into work in the quiet house. The familiar hum of the computer, the comforting routine of emails and files, it all felt so wonderfully normal. I let myself get lost in it, pushing aside the strange memories of the past few days, hoping to hold on to the calm. But just as I was settling in, I heard a soft, drawn-out creak, like someone slowly pushing a door open. My heart skipped. I looked up from the screen, eyes snapping to the door. It was open just a crack, though I was certain I'd closed it when I'd sat down. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely a whisper, straining to hear any response. Silence. A chill crept down my spine as I pushed back from the desk and rose, staring at that sliver of open door as if expecting something to appear. Cautiously, I stepped forward, hand reaching to push the door wider, breath held tight in my chest. And that's when I saw her. There, just outside my office, sat Dolly. She was propped up in the hallway, button eyes locked on the door, head tilted slightly as if studying me. That stitched smile, wider than I remembered, looked almost triumphant. I stumbled back, my stomach twisting as realization settled in. I had thrown her away, I'd seen her at the bottom of that dumpster. But here she was, back in my house, as if she'd never left. Dolly sat there, dirt and grime clinging to her dress, bits of garbage caught in her fabric, button eyes fixed on me with that unsettling grin. For a moment, all I could do was stare, frozen by disbelief and dread. I backed up, not noticing the wall behind me until my shoulders hit it. I knew I'd tossed her out, I'd seen her hit the bottom of that dumpster. Yet here she was, sitting on my hallway floor, looking more sinister than ever. And then, before I could even process what I was seeing, Dolly began to rise. Her small body lifted, hovering just above the floor. The air thickened around me, charged, as if the entire house was holding its breath. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Then, in a rush, a flood of images overtook my mind. Terrifying visions, a forest cloaked in darkness, twisted trees, screaming faces. A sense of overpowering, inescapable dread. The world around me dissolved, swallowed by shadows. My vision blurred, and in the next instant, I was no longer in my hallway. I was in a forest, shrouded in a dense, suffocating darkness pressing in from all sides. My heart pounded as I ran, legs churning through thick underbrush, lungs burning as I gasped for air. It felt like a nightmare, but the terror was too raw, too immediate. Something was chasing me. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and my blood froze. A massive, monstrous beast loped through the shadows, moving with an unnatural, jerky fluidity, like its limbs barely held together. It looked like a wolf, but far larger, with a gaping maw that stretched grotesquely across its face, as if held together by threads. Its eyes glowed an eerie red, like buttons sewn deep into its skull, and its body was crudely stitched together, horribly reminiscent of Dolly. The creature growled, a guttural, multi-voiced sound that made my skin crawl. I stumbled, legs buckling beneath me, collapsing to the forest floor. The stench of decay filled the air as the beast loomed over me, its hot, foul breath pouring over my face. I was staring into the face of pure nightmare, horror given form. I tried to scramble up, but it was too fast. The beast lowered its head, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. I pressed my arms against its maw, desperate to push it back, but it was impossibly strong. Black, oily liquid dripped from its mouth, splattering onto my skin, the stench suffocating. "This isn't real!" I shouted, my voice breaking with desperation. "Leave me alone!" The creature's red eyes narrowed, and I felt a crushing pressure as it bore down on me. Its teeth sank into my shoulder, sending searing pain shooting through me. I screamed, agony tearing through my body, blood hot against my skin as it poured from the wound. With a surge of desperate energy, I brought my knee up, slamming it into the beast's chest, trying to shove it back. It barely flinched. That twisted maw curled into a sick, mocking grin, and its red eyes glinted with a terrifying, playful glimmer. "Wake up! Wake up!" I screamed, focusing every ounce of my will on breaking free of this nightmare. I knew I was trapped, but I couldn't surrender. Images of my wife, my daughter, flashed before my eyes, filling me with a fierce resolve. I couldn't let this creature win. I had to get back to them. With a final scream, I pushed against the beast, pouring every bit of strength I had into one last, desperate shove. My body ached, my mind felt splintered, but I held on to them, my family, as I clawed at the ground, pulling myself forward, trying to escape. I kept fighting, clinging to that stubborn spark of hope. Then, in a sudden, blinding flash, the forest was gone. I was back in the hallway, Dolly lying lifeless on the floor in front of me. My head spun, caught between the nightmare forest and reality. But one sensation cut through the fog, a sharp, searing pain on my chest. I pressed my hand to it, feeling a strange, hot sting beneath my shirt. With shaky hands, I pulled off my shirt and looked down. My skin was marked by thick, jagged scars, pale and twisted, like they'd been there for years. They traced the exact spot where the beast had bitten, a brutal reminder of whatever I had just endured, or survived. I looked down at Dolly, her button eyes staring blankly up, her face forever frozen in that eerie stitched grin. A surge of anger swelled inside me, pushing aside the confusion and horror. Enough was enough. This doll had slithered into my life, crept into my daughter's mind, and I wasn't about to let it haunt us any longer. Without another thought, I grabbed her and marched to the garage. I found the kerosene can, almost spilling it in my haste, and grabbed a box of matches we kept for family bonfires in the backyard. Today, the fire would be for something else. The backyard was silent, almost unsettlingly so, as I headed toward the fire pit. I tossed Dolly in, watching as her soft body crumpled onto the grate, and stuffed old newspapers around her. The doll's face stared up at me, her button eyes almost pleading. Out of nowhere, I felt a strange hesitation, a sick, nagging feeling, like I was about to destroy something important, something I ought to cherish. It was ridiculous, yet the feeling was almost overwhelming, as though Dolly herself was reaching into my mind, trying to make me doubt. No, I told myself. She's just a doll. I shook off the doubt, forcing my hand steady as I unscrewed the kerosene cap and doused her, watching the liquid soak into her dress and mat her tangled hair. Taking a deep breath, I struck a match and, without another pause, dropped it in. The flames leapt up instantly, but instead of the usual reds and oranges, they burned a strange, dark purple, licking over Dolly's body with an unnatural glow. I watched, transfixed, as her face seemed to contort within the flames, button eyes bulging slightly, that stitched smile twisting as if she were alive, resisting the fire. But I stood firm, watching until there was nothing left but ashes. I stayed by the fire pit, ignoring the ping of work emails and notifications from my laptop inside. None of it mattered now. I kept vigil, waiting until the doll had burned down to charred scraps, the purple flames fading to smoldering embers. Hours later, it was time to pick up my daughter from school. I finally stood up, feeling an odd mixture of relief and exhaustion. Dolly was gone, reduced to nothing but a blackened pile of ash. Yet the scars on my chest tingled, a reminder of the nightmare I couldn't quite forget. When I picked up my daughter that afternoon, she came running to me, her face bright with a grin I hadn't seen in what felt like ages. It was as though the last few weeks, the tantrums, the outbursts, the obsession with Dolly, had never happened. She hugged me, practically bouncing with excitement. "Daddy! Guess what? I got a gold star on my spelling test. And we made clay animals in art. Mine's a bunny, and I'm bringing it home tomorrow." I hugged her back, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. It was like my little girl had returned, the happy, light-hearted child I knew before Dolly came into our lives. The dark cloud that had followed her seemed to be gone, leaving nothing but warmth. She didn't ask about Dolly. She didn't even seem to notice the doll was gone. That night at dinner, she chattered about her day, filling us in on every little detail, her laughter finally back to brighten our home. My wife and I exchanged relieved smiles, daring to believe it was over. Later, after our daughter was asleep, I told my wife everything. The nightmare in the forest, the scars on my chest, and how Dolly had been lying there in the hallway, filthy in waiting. I described burning her in the backyard, the strange purple flames, how I'd watched until every trace was gone. My wife listened, her face shifting from shock to disbelief. I could tell she struggled to believe it. Who wouldn't? I wasn't sure I'd believe it if I hadn't seen it myself. But in the end, she squeezed my hand, a soft smile spreading across her face. "Real or not," she said, "I'm just glad that thing is gone. Our daughter's back, and that's what matters." I nodded, feeling the scars itch under my shirt, a reminder of the nightmare I'd come through. But as I listened to the soft sound of my daughter's breathing from her room, I felt certain, we were finally safe. Dolly was gone. Our daughter was free. And, for the first time in weeks, our home felt like ours again.